my time to talk about a theoretical framing that we have applied to local government and their efforts to collaborate on regional issues called the Institutional Collective Action Framework, and provide some examples of that. The problem that this framing deals with is the problem of fragmented authority. And this is a common dilemma across lots of different systems that, it's sort of like when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. In these two presentations ahead of me, sort of seeing some fragmentation of authority that leads to collective dilemmas. Situations where
Please continue.
Okay. So if we start with the definition of governance that we had in the very first presentation, coordinating distributive interests, actors, resources in the pursuit of collective ends. That's exactly what I want to focus on in the role of cities, internally and externally, horizontally within a region, as well as vertically at different levels of government. And collective action dilemmas result because there's fragmentation of authority. Horizontally, it's a situation where you have multiple jurisdictions, but the problems have a different spatial dimension that goes beyond the borders of the jurisdiction themselves. And we have then scale issues related to cost economies of scale, and we have spatial spillovers, where the actions of one jurisdiction spill over and affect other jurisdictions. We also have fragmentation of authority vertically in most political systems. We have local governments and sometimes subunits within those local governments, as well as state, provincial, regional governments, and a central government. And the agencies of each can be sharing authority for specific problems. Think of issues like water use, where in the US and in most countries, there's multiple jurisdictions layered on top of each other that share responsibility for that function. And the bottom one is cut off a little bit in the slide. Functional collective action problems. Here, when we're looking at a single organization, and my focus is on cities, we have fragmentation across functional agencies and departments that deal with problems that may be closely related to each other, which spill over functionally, but are siloed in ways that there's a need for integration. So the idea across all these is there's a need for mechanisms to integrate those fragmented authorities to make collective decisions. The governance arrangements among multiple authorities are arrayed in terms of two dimensions here. How encompassing they are. That's as small as a single two jurisdictions and one service, to broader encompassing arrangements, and how authoritative. So getting back to what we talked about in this last slide, are decisions sort of voluntary choices among participants, or is there some level of coercion and authority involved? And we can take those two dimensions and define different points on those dimensions, and this is sort of a stylized way of doing it. The first, when I think about authority, I'm thinking about the ability of individual units to make decisions for themselves without any intervention of an authority. As opposed to an imposed authority at the other extreme. In a voluntary setting, the enforcement mechanism is a social mechanism. And we know from a lot of sociological work in organizations that norms, culture, expectations can provide very strong constraints on behavior. Taking sort of a Douglas North type definition of institutions, they can provide strong institutions to constrain behavior in certain circumstances. The next point on that scale is legal authority, legal mechanisms to enforce collective agreements. Then we move to delegated authority, where you're creating a new authority, in this case a new governmental authority, where the individual participants are giving up some of their authority and turning it over to this new entity. And then finally, you have systems where the authority from a higher level is imposed to create a collective organization. The second dimension is how complex is the arrangement, ranging from a bilateral agreement on a single service all the way to collective decision-making that involves all the affected parties and across multiple services and functions. So the first step in this process has been somewhat descriptive, that we've done lots of work in the US context where we've mapped out institutional arrangements which match those categories and try to understand how they operate and when they are chosen. And this case is specific to the US, but you see there's 12 cells. The three on the right-hand column are not self-organizing. They're imposed by a high-level authority, and they can range in their complexity. But the other 9 are chosen by the participants themselves. There's at least some level of self-organization there, and they can choose, for instance, in the lower left, informal networks as a way of collectively governing a specific problem, ranging to creating a regional authority in the upper right of that 9. That when we define it by those 2 dimensions, 2 transaction costs are immediately apparent as we move along those dimensions. The first is decision costs. That the more complex a decision, the more actors, the more services, the greater the information demands, the greater the bargaining time, which imposes a cost on participants. The second is autonomy costs. As we move on that horizontal dimension, we lose the ability to make the choices that are our first preferences because we agree to accept a collective decision. And all the way to the right, the decisions imposed on us. So if we go back to that example of U.S. metropolitan areas, we see that we have a diagonal there that defines those transaction costs, where informal networks would have the lowest decision and lowest authority costs, and externally imposed authority, such as amalgamation, would carry the highest decision costs. So if those were the only considerations, we could stop the story here and say, well, the obvious choice is an informal network, because we can minimize both those costs, we can solve the collective problem. But we know from our observations of the real world that we have more complex, more authoritative mechanisms in play, and informal networks oftentimes are not sufficient. The reason why is because there is what we're defining as collaboration risk in the process. The actors may prefer a self-organizing network because it minimizes their decision costs, it gives them the maximum autonomy, but they recognize that those sort of arrangements are likely to fail. And in specific situations that we will try to define, the mechanisms that are necessary to resolve a collective dilemma will need to shift up and to the right to satisfy the criteria that the participants have to believe that the collaboration will hold and be successful before they'll enter it in the first place. We talk about three different types of collaboration risk in applying this in urban settings and more generally. The first are coordination problems, where in order to collaborate, you first need to identify partners who would also benefit from collaborating with you, that share like preferences on specific alternatives. You also have to resolve division problems, because with a collaborative agreement, it's not just that everybody's better off, but there's a sense of fairness among the parties in the division of costs and benefits. And an unfair distribution will lead to non-participation, even if Pareto, the participants are all better off. And finally, defection. The risk that your partners will free ride on your actions or renege on their commitments. So the framing of institutional collective action theory is that we try to define specific types of collaboration risk and then use them to explain the choices of collaboration mechanism across those two dimensions and the performance of those mechanisms. The type nature of the problem is the first criteria that we use. Scale economies, externalities, which space plays a large part of. And in some of the work, we've tried to define the problems in terms of coordination, division, and cooperation. And so, using a game theoretic approach, we can sometimes divide up the problems in that way to think about the appropriate solutions. The second is existing institutions. That's, the focus of this work is on local governments collaborating with each other to deal with regional problems. And in almost every context we've looked at, there are higher level authorities, higher level rules which shape and constrain what they can do. And they can have a tremendous impact on the strategies and the payoffs for various actions. Third, the characteristics and preferences of actors. And here we're specifically interested in the problem of defection and as well as information, and how the characteristics of other actors send signals that you have a partner who has the right information or will be trustworthy and keep their commitments. The network literature suggests that homophily can be a potent signal in this situation, that people will share with, communicate with, link with others that are similar to themselves. In this context, we can think about the characteristics of jurisdictions and the extent to which they are similar in ways that would lead to preference alignment, different in ways that would compensate for resource dependencies. We can also think about it politically, in terms of ideology, in terms of government structure, in terms of the constituency demands as defined by geography and space. And we've had a sizable research program in the last decade that has applied this framework, investigating each of those cells individually, some case analysis, a lot of comparative analysis, most of it with single mechanisms, looking at one mechanism at a time, and across a range of policy areas. One of the extensions that I'm going to talk about in a minute is applying it within cities, looking at the functional collective action problem, and then some of our ongoing efforts to apply it in other parts of the world. I'll report a little bit on the work we've been doing in China, but we have ongoing work in Europe and Central America as well. Now, I have 3 empirical studies I want to talk about. I left the analysis slides in here. I'm just going to skip through them. If someone has questions on that, I'll be glad to answer, but the hourglass is falling. The first study is looking at sustainability networks among cities within a region. And here we're looking at the informal policy networks that are used by governments to coordinate their actions related to climate policy and sustainability more generally. And we're focusing on the structure of their network decisions and the partners they choose in terms of reducing the collaboration risks that we talked about earlier. And sustainability is a really interesting question to apply this to, because it has information and commitment dimensions. And the information one seems sort of readily apparent in terms of what's the best practice in terms of dealing with specific issues related to climate and sustainability, where jurisdictions can learn from each other. There is a very real commitment problem as well, because the literature has shown that cities engage in sustainability not just out of their concern for the climate benefits, but because there are very specific distributional consequences for their community. And they oftentimes have spillovers across their neighbors' communities. That sustainability actions improve things like air quality, transportation access, access to green areas, walkability, biking, public health, things that have value to constituents, and the literature suggests are really the reason that communities adopt these in the first place. But if that's the case, most of these benefits cross jurisdiction boundaries. And so there are regional consequences in terms of things like air quality and transportation systems that require coordination and cooperation among partners. So the co-benefits of sustainability create collaboration risk. So the question we ask is, how do cities structure their network relationships to overcome those risks? And so we want to begin to get a handle on which other actors in that region cities choose to work with to share information regarding sustainability, and try to identify the strategies that they use that would be predicted by the ICA framework. So we focus on partner choice, and again we can frame it in terms of whether it's a coordination or a cooperation problem. And in the collaboration literature, cooperation gets defined in different ways. That there's a good deal of literature that defines cooperation, so the easiest type of collaboration. I frame it a different way, sort of borrowing from economists' idea of coordination versus cooperation, where coordination, the actors share the same interests, but just have to define an equilibrium point where they'll be better off. Whereas cooperation means the actors fundamentally start with different goals, and it can be in the interests of one actor to defect from another. So thinking about those two problems of coordination and cooperation, if the network can improve information flow, then it can assist with overcoming the coordination problem. If the network is able to provide credibility, signals of trust and commitment, it's able to overcome the cooperation dilemmas. And what we have done in some of our previous work is compare across policy areas and which types of networks occur. In service delivery networks, we found that information is dominated. The types of networks which enhance the supply of information and the flow of information. In economic development networks, where there is a very strong benefit from defection, we find that the networks have a very strong credibility component where the actors self-organize in ways that they work with partners, and so we have reciprocal relationships being built, or we work with partners of partners, friends of friends, and do triangle type structures. We base this on a survey we did of local governments in Florida, where we sent out questionnaires asking them who in their region they work with on sustainability issues. We are focusing here on the subset of cities in the Miami metropolitan area. We have 33 respondents in this area, and this is really the most interesting region in the state to look at because they really are being directly affected by climate change and one of the most affected areas in the globe. So what we want to do is, and I don't want to get into methods here, I'll never get through this, but we just want to identify whether the patterns that conform to that trust bonding structure or the efficiency information structure occur more frequently than expected in a random analysis within those policy networks in South Florida. And in addition to those structural variables, we include characteristics of the government and characteristics of the constituents. And I'm going to skip to the findings. What we found is that the results really did look almost like our economic development results. That the information, more open networks were less likely to occur, and the closed networks, the bonding networks, there was less support for reciprocity, but particularly for bonding, was more likely to occur. And we attribute that to the spillovers of the co-benefits of sustainability programs. That we also found some evidence of structural similarity shaping partner choice. That communities that have the same form of government were more likely to collaborate with each other. And population density, where the similarity on those scales led to more collaboration. Income had a negative effect, that you were more likely to collaborate when there was divergence in income, one higher income, one lower income community. So in that study, we found that networks, even though they are the subject to the most transaction risk, can be effective in collaboration across that region the process by which that happens is the actors choose their partners in a way that helps them overcome that collaboration risk. The second study is one that's forthcoming in JPART, and it's I think available ahead of publication now on their website. That this is our first attempt to look at the functional collective action problem. the problem of siloed departments and agencies within government and how they organize and structure their governance to integrate across and solve those functional collective action problems. In the paper, we look at two questions. What accounts for the governance structure that's used for sustainability within the cities, and then how does that affect their policy portfolio? How integrated then are the actual policies that result? I'm just going to talk about that first question. What factors explain the governance structure choice, the governance design? And here we are looking at two dimensions of the internal governance. The first is the scope of the lead agency's authority. The agency that is primarily responsible for sustainability within the city. How much authority does it have over the various dimensions of the problem? In this case, how much authority over other departments within the government? And the second is the number of agencies involved in planning sustainability initiatives. We can think of this almost like a network measure because we have a checklist of agencies and asking who is involved in decision making. So our expectation is that you will have more integration when you have more agencies involved in the planning, and there also is a more authoritative agency on top which can direct the efforts. So we have the formal and informal networks to organize collective decisions. And in terms of the transaction risk, we look at three factors: the structure of the political institutions, the capacity of the government, and then the politics of the community, and the interest group support for sustainability. And here we start with the Integrated City Sustainability Database, which if anybody's interested, I'd be glad to talk with them about. We have survey data for 680 cities, over 50,000, almost the entire population in the US, with over 1,000 survey questions responded to. And we have a second survey and that was 2010, second survey that we conducted in 2015 that replicates some of the questions related to the sustainability policy instruments. And what we do is first a descriptive analysis, and then we do some predictive models to predict the location of the lead agency and the number of partners. And in terms of these two dimensions, these also are defining some case study work that we're doing. That we took the survey and identified 8 high-performing communities, and then selected high-performing communities that fit into those 4 categories of governance structure, because we had some high-performing cities with very different governance structures, and we are doing the casework to understand how that process works and the extent to which they really are able to integrate across policies within these different structures. And we have a lot of variance in terms of the number of partners and of who the lead agency is, as is reflected in those 2 bar graphs. Okay, let's skip that. What we found is what I think is some really interesting results. That we found that structure matters. That having an overarching sustainability department is not the most popular choice. I think only about a third of the communities actually had that structure. But where they did, it made a big difference. It made a difference in terms of the factors that were important in explaining the institutional choice, and it also had an important difference in terms of the integration of the policies that resulted. In looking at that choice, what we found is that there was a clear spatial dimension to the politics of institutional design. That when we looked at environmental and development interests, their effect on the institution of choice was rather weak. When we looked at neighborhood associations, that there was a strong relationship between having neighborhood association and homeowner association support for sustainability and creating an overarching sustainability agency. And what our case studies are beginning to show is that sustainability, it's sold as this sort of global commons problem, but it really has very micro distributional impacts. And sort of the new political patronage may be sustainability, because it cross-cuts all these different functions. And it has neighborhood effects in terms of livability, walkability, bikeability, community gardens, and down the list, all these things that can fall within the sustainability rubric, which have very concentrated geographic impacts. We found much the same thing, not quite as strong a support, when we looked at the informal policy network. And what we found is that we had more fragmented decisions that were integrated with the situation where we had neighborhood support, and also where we had district-based elections. Okay, so we are working on those 8 case studies now, and have a new survey out in the field, that's going to do a network analysis within those 8 communities, which we think will bring to bear stronger evidence on sort of the actual dynamics that are causing these relationships. But we're very excited about the direction this is going. The third, I'm not going to talk about because I'm out of time. Maybe just a word or two. We replicated this study as best we could in China, and we had hand-coded all media reports within 4 regions related to environmental and climate agreements within those 4 regions, and found some support for the idea that you have more formalized agreements when you have greater complexity and higher transaction risk, especially when we looked at differences in the political power of the jurisdictions involved, where you had these power asymmetries defined by their level in the Communist Party hierarchy, that the local governments protected themselves by having more formalized agreements. So that was really quick, and I can skip ahead. Okay, conclusion. I said we've been working this framework for a while, but we're just now sort of testing the extent to which we can apply it in other contexts. That it's proven to be very useful in understanding the way that city governments operate to deal with issues of fragmentation within metropolitan regions, within cities. I think the most important question is, how generalizable is this? Can we take this beyond just the U.S. context and apply it in other contexts? And what are the different policy arenas where this can provide leverage and new insight? We are concluding here that fragmentation authority requires some governance mechanism to integrate across those fragmented authorities, or that will have less than optimal policy outcomes. The different forms of government are related to the collaboration risks faced by the actors that we examine in these studies, and the capacity of government arrangements to mitigate those risks depends in part on the structure of the collaboration. So additional work is necessary across scale, and I don't think I have it here, but also to look at it across multiple services and multiple contexts. Here we've been looking at one mechanism in a single context. In practice, you have multiple mechanisms at the same time. You have formal agreements, you have informal networks within the same policy arena operating simultaneously. And so, how do we understand those multiplex relationships and how they relate to each other, which is one of the big questions we want to tackle. We want to apply it in other contexts, and we've begun to do some work in Europe and have talked about applying it to international agreements, but haven't gone that route yet. And we also are linking the mechanisms to performance. With the functional ICA study, as I mentioned, this JPART article has some reported results on the integration of the policy portfolio that follows from different structures. With regional economic development, we have this unique situation where we have 3 waves of network survey in the Orlando metropolitan area. And so we will be able to look at the coevolution of the network itself and the economic performance of those cities over time. And now I'm done. Thank you.